Fake HOA scam ruined my life. My wife and I had always heard stories about homeowners associations, HOAs, and how they could be a real pain. We had made up our minds that we would never buy a house in an HOA. We just couldn't imagine living with a bunch of people who felt like they had the right to tell us how to live our lives. We wanted to be free to make our own decisions, paint our house any color we wanted, and even put up a big, crazy sculpture in our front yard if we felt like it. We didn't want someone looking over our shoulders and constantly giving us a hard time for something we thought was completely harmless. Then, we found our dream house. It was perfect. The only problem was, it was in a neighborhood that was surrounded by a bunch of other houses, all lined up perfectly on each side of our street. And there were trees, lots of trees, and we liked trees. It felt peaceful, like a place we could really make our own. I mean, the trees might have made it a little tricky to see out our windows if we wanted to paint the house bright pink, but we had promised ourselves we wouldn't live in an HOA. So we bought the house and moved in. We figured if we kept a low profile, we could avoid any problems. For about a week, we were super happy. Then, one day, there was a knock at our front door. A friendly-looking woman stood there, smiling, and she started to tell us all about how excited she was to welcome us to the neighborhood. She even told us she was the president of the HOA. We tried to hide our shock, because we were sure she was just being polite. "What HOA?" we asked. "Oh, we're right behind you. The houses behind yours are all in the HOA." We had no idea, and honestly, it didn't make much sense to us. We had driven around the neighborhood a few times and never noticed any signs that it was a controlled community. Plus, we really wanted to believe the place was free from those crazy HOA rules. "Okay, well, nice to meet you," I said. My wife gave her a shy smile, and we closed the door. Over the next few months, our suspicions grew stronger. There was a tiny piece of land between the edge of our property and the sidewalk. It was just a strip of grass, like a really narrow slice of pie. And everyone told us it was owned by the HOA. We figured they were just using it for extra green space for the whole neighborhood. It wasn't really our problem, so we just decided to ignore it. But there was something weird about that little strip of grass. Every once in a while, we would find old bottles or bags of trash that someone had tossed over the fence. And it wasn't just trash either. Some days we even found a couple of discarded chicken bones or something that looked suspiciously like a broken-off bike handle. We kept wondering who was letting their junk sit on this tiny piece of land that no one seemed to really care about. It turns out we were right to be suspicious. There were these massive, amazing old trees right on our property line. I'm talking huge, like you could stand under one of their branches and they'd shade an entire football field. We were so lucky, and it was worth the extra effort to make sure those trees were well cared for. It seemed like one tree was getting a little too close to the road. I had a feeling it was only a matter of time before a huge branch broke off and crashed down on the sidewalk or even into a car. It's a scary thought when you realize that it's not just about the damage to your car or some guy's fender, it's about the chance someone could be seriously hurt, or worse. We couldn't just let that happen. We decided we were responsible for these beautiful old trees. We hired an arborist, someone whose job it is to care for trees, and he was a pro. He came over and said we needed to get rid of that big branch, which was dangerously close to the sidewalk and even looked a little cracked. The arborist suggested we cut back some of the dead branches on the other tree, too. He brought in a huge crew and these crazy saws that sounded like angry robots. It was super noisy, but that crew worked fast, and the job was done in a couple of hours. It cost us almost $1,500, which we thought was a little pricey but worth it, for our safety and for our beloved old trees. That left us with a huge pile of cut-up wood branches. We were going to haul them away to the wood recycling place the next weekend. I had a business trip to deal with, so we had to wait to haul it away until the following weekend. The wood pile was on the grass between the fence and the sidewalk, and we made sure it was nicely stacked so it wasn't blocking anyone's path. The next weekend was a busy one. We had family coming into town, and it seemed like there was 1,000 things going on. By the time the weekend was over, the wood was still right where it had been. I knew I would be able to haul it away on the following weekend. I left for my trip on Monday morning, but I hadn't even made it to the airport when I got a frantic phone call from my wife. I could barely hear her. There were all these crazy noises in the background, but I knew something was really wrong. She sounded like she was about to cry. "It's the HOA president," she sobbed. She explained that the woman had come to our front door and was yelling about the wood pile being on their property. My wife told her that it was too heavy for her to move by herself, and we'd get rid of it that weekend, but the woman didn't care. She told my wife she had to move the wood right then and there, and she started yelling, like the woman was ready to lose her mind. She even called my wife names and said things like, "Who do you think you are? Leaving junk all over our property. This is a classy neighborhood. We don't put up with this kind of behavior from new neighbors." I felt terrible for my wife. I couldn't believe that some random neighbor would come barging onto our property and scream at my wife, and my wife is not a person who fights with anyone, or even yells. She would do anything to avoid a confrontation. It's crazy because she's got this tiny little voice and is only about 5'2". I'm almost a foot taller and my wife's strength is incredible. But she never yells or gets angry. My wife told the woman that I would be back the following week, and I could get rid of the wood as soon as I got home. But that just made the woman yell even louder. This isn't a game, we've got rules, I'm not joking. If that wood isn't off my property by this afternoon, I'm going to have it taken away, and it will cost you more than your house is worth. My wife panicked. The woman wouldn't let her close the door. It felt like she just wanted to create a huge scene. My wife tried to reason with the crazy woman, but nothing would work. Then the woman really lost it. She started shouting that it was our property. This was a very serious HOA problem. She had no choice but to call the cops, and she would not be ignored. She must have sensed my wife's fear and just really doubled down on her intimidation. If you don't move it now, she yelled, I'm going to call the police and have you arrested. My wife knew there was nothing she could do to change the situation. She was really upset, and she thought I'd be furious when I got back, so she grabbed a wheelbarrow and managed to move the big pieces of wood, even though they were heavy. She moved them to the other side of the fence and onto the back of our property. She was so angry and frustrated, and she vowed that when I got back we were going to figure out exactly who this woman was and why she felt like she could be so rude to her, and maybe, just maybe, put a stop to all of her bullying once and for all. I got home on the weekend, and I was not a happy camper. I couldn't believe she had come barging onto our property and intimidated my wife into moving those heavy pieces of wood, not to mention yelling at her. I'm going to go talk to her, I said. My wife looked scared, and I felt this wave of frustration and anger wash over me. It was my house, my yard, and for the life of me, I couldn't figure out why anyone would behave in such a way. Don't do anything stupid, my wife warned, she's nuts. You never know what that woman is going to do. She gave me directions to the woman's house and I walked over to their house. I knocked on the door and I could hear movement inside. But they didn't open the door, they wouldn't even answer. I could tell they were in there, they had to have been. But it felt like they knew who I was, and they weren't ready to face me, so they just stayed quiet, as if they'd rather disappear altogether. So much for being polite, I thought to myself. I felt this angry wave rising in me and it was hard to calm it down. I turned and walked back home, but all I could think about was that rude woman who yelled at my wife and how it had ruined our otherwise perfect weekend. We had so much going on, and it felt like we had spent half the day dealing with a problem we never thought we'd have. There was a small section of our fence near the edge of our property that had gotten a little damaged. We had noticed it for a couple of weeks, but there just hadn't been a chance to fix it yet. I finally got around to fixing it one weekend in the spring. It turns out that the fence had been pushed out of line because of that weird hedge that grew along the edge of our property. It looked really wild and it didn't seem like anyone ever trimmed it back, and it seemed to be growing taller every day. She probably let that hedge grow wild on purpose, to show us who was boss, my wife thought. She was so sure the woman was intentionally creating trouble. So I trimmed back the hedge and fixed the fence. I really couldn't believe that someone would let a hedge grow all the way up to the fence. It's a lot of extra work. And then, we noticed something strange. There was a section of our fence that seemed to be on HOA property, which is what the crazy lady had called that little strip of land. This had never bothered us before, since it had never come up in any of the papers we signed when we bought the house. There was no mention of HOAs or rules in the house buying paperwork. That meant we were in a very real bind. The crazy lady claimed the property was hers, so who had the right to fix our fence? Then I had a really strange thought. I couldn't understand why a grown woman, the president of the HOA, and all, would yell at my wife like that, especially about something as silly as wood that needed to be moved. And if she really was in charge of an HOA, why wasn't she taking better care of the property? If it were mine, I'd fix the fence, and I'd make sure the grass was mowed regularly, and I'd make sure that annoying hedge wasn't growing up against my neighbor's fences. It was so strange, and it felt like the woman was looking for problems. I decided it was time to figure out who really owned the grass between the sidewalk and our fence. That might have made all the difference in deciding if the crazy HOA president was in her right mind when she yelled at my wife. I felt a little frustrated, but I was determined to clear the air about that piece of land and put an end to the woman's bizarre HOA charade once and for all. I started by contacting the county and speaking to all kinds of different people in a lot of different departments. Finally, I reached the county roads department. They looked over our property and explained that that little piece of land wasn't actually owned by the HOA or anyone else. It belonged to the county and was part of the road. The lady had lied. The county workers said that she was trying to scare my wife. They were really nice about it, and they explained that the road had never really had a proper HOA. I'd been right, that place didn't really have a true wall. I almost laughed out loud. I could see how this had all gone down, and my wife felt justified. The roads workers said I could cut down the crazy hedge that was making such a mess of our fence, and told me I was allowed to move it onto my property. And in case I needed more confirmation, the county workers said they'd check for any official records of an HOA in our area, just to be sure. I decided I needed to do some digging. This whole situation was so confusing and made me even more irritated by this wall lady, but I knew that if she wasn't running a real WA, that she was probably a scammer who had been taking money from neighbors for years. And the idea of people losing their hard-earned money because this woman was faking her role as WA president was really upsetting. I felt a new surge of frustration rise inside me and this new feeling that maybe I could use this strange situation to stand up for my neighbors and put an end to this whole mess. I knew what I had to do. I decided to do what any normal, decent person would do in this situation. I called some of my neighbors to get their take on the situation. There were other homeowners in the area who felt the same way I did. Most of them had been paying the WA dues to the crazy woman for years. They hadn't known about the fake WA either. The only real work she had done was to rake the leaves off the tiny bit of land she claimed as her own. And she organized one potluck party a year. The crazy woman had taken over $100,000 in cash, just by pretending to be the leader of this non-existent WA. I was absolutely shocked, and the thought that the crazy woman was living large, thanks to money she had scammed from our neighbors, was really irking me. But I knew there was more that we could do. I decided to go over what I had discovered with my neighbors. I took a look at our neighborhood and, sure enough, there were 36 houses. We were right in the middle of this community, a little island of our own, with houses all around us, in a perfect line. I knew what I had to do. I figured I would use all of my free time to try to make a difference in the neighborhood. I had this idea that I could get the county records to all 36 families in our little community and make this into a teachable moment for them about being wary of scams. We printed out a letter that explained what I had learned about the WA. I wrote a simple, short letter to each of our neighbors, just letting them know the facts and making sure that they understood what I had found out about the crazy woman. I explained to them that there was no evidence of an HOA being registered in our county and the crazy woman was probably not who she said she was. I even used my home computer and printer to print out 36 copies of the letter for our neighbors. I didn't want to waste their money or their time. Plus it gave me the opportunity to help a few neighbors that needed help around the house. There was no time to waste. I needed to get this right. I was getting really anxious and I had this terrible feeling that this lady would try to intimidate my neighbors even more once they found out we had blown the lid off her scam. I knew we had to be careful, so I got together with a couple of my trusted neighbors and they promised to help. They were just as upset as we were, and they vowed to help expose the woman's lies and make sure that it never happened again. The neighbors worked together. They gathered evidence. They checked old records, contacted the county again, and confirmed all of my findings. We all knew she was guilty, and that it was time for justice. They were angry, but it felt like a good kind of anger. We put those letters into 36 separate envelopes. We bought stamps at the post office. And then we sent them out. I couldn't wait to see what would happen next. We were right to trust the good folks in the neighborhood. After a few months, a group of our neighbors organized a little get-together. They were super happy to catch up, share some barbecue and discuss the latest news and gossip, and have a few beers. But I could tell they had something bigger in mind, a secret agenda. We didn't have to wait long. One of my neighbors stepped up and started telling the whole story to our friends and family. The neighbors were all super annoyed that this crazy woman had taken advantage of them for so many years. They told everyone how the woman had gotten away with her crazy scam. I felt such a sense of relief. It was great to know my neighbors could count on each other to support each other. It's the kind of community we'd been looking for. They had their attorneys working on a plan. They were going to go after the woman and force her to return all the money that she had stolen. It took almost a year to gather evidence and get the paperwork in order. The process was really slow, but the neighbors were prepared to fight. It felt good to know they were determined. And they won. The neighbors finally got their day in court. They explained what they had discovered, and the judge understood that the crazy lady had cheated everyone in the neighborhood out of a lot of money she had stolen over a decade. They were victorious. They had made it right. The crazy woman had to pay back all the money she had taken, and she couldn't run an HOA any longer. We had stopped her, and we'd made sure the money would go back to the people who earned it, the people in our community. In the end, I discovered that the crazy lady wasn't even a resident of the neighborhood. She had used her role as a real estate agent to scam her way into making extra money. It turns out the crazy wall lady was only living there because her apartment had been flooded and she was renting a house while her home was being fixed. We were amazed at her nerve to charge her own clients money for an organization she never officially joined. After her fraud had been exposed, I decided to reach out to the real estate licensing board. My wife and I thought the woman's actions would hurt the reputation of all real estate agents. The woman had abused her role as a realtor, and that had to stop. The Real Estate Licensing Board took our concerns seriously and investigated the case. They got in touch with my neighbors and they told me that the board would be looking into the matter further. They were going to review the woman's actions and possibly make sure she was not allowed to sell houses any longer. I hoped their investigation would go smoothly, and I thought this might be a chance to help make a change in the way that realtors are governed, to stop bad actors like the crazy wall lady from harming innocent buyers. In the end, we all won. I still felt a little bad for the crazy wall woman. After her crimes were discovered, I realized it was not a simple matter. My wife suggested it might have been easy to get caught up in an act. Maybe she started with a small little lie, and then got greedy over time and went too far. But she'd done a lot of harm, and we were glad the situation had been sorted out. The woman didn't seem to have friends or a family of her own, and I couldn't help but wonder if this would have happened if she'd had someone in her life who truly cared for her, someone who would have stepped up to call her out before her lies turned into a real-life crime. My neighbors and I had the opportunity to support each other, to do the right thing, and to use this experience to make sure that our neighborhood was free from crazy HOAs, fake presidents and scammers, and greedy women who wanted to steal from our community.